All right, good morning or afternoon. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange and our partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar showcasing SageSuccess Project highlights. There will be three 10-minute presentations by U.S. Geological Survey researchers involved in the project. Today's presentations are gradients in sagebrush recovery after fire are associated with soil and biocrust characteristics presented by Dave Barnard. Population Trajectories of Sagebrush After Restoration, Connecting Patterns and Process by Bob Shriver, and To Plant or to Seed, a Good Question by Dave Pyke. Before I introduce our presenters, I will go over some webinar details. We will be taking questions after each short presentation as well as at the end of all three. If you have questions or comments, please type them into the questions window of your control panel located at the top right of your screen. Please feel free to submit questions during the webinar at any time, since it's nice to have some ready in the queue. I also want to let you know that whatever you do in your control panel does not affect the webinar, so you are welcome to type a test message or test your audio at any time during the webinar. If you're having problems with your audio, please open your audio window and check your audio selections. Now I will introduce our first presenter. Dave Barnard did his undergraduate work at the University of Florida in environmental horticulture, his master's degree work at Oregon State University in forest ecophysiology, and his PhD work at Colorado State University in tree ecophysiology and micrometeorology. Dave was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Boulder Creek Critical Zone Observatory at CU Boulder, and then as an ecologist with the USGS in Boise, where his research has focused on measurement and modeling of landscape-level sagebrush steppe ecology and restoration. Welcome, Dave, and I will make you the presenter right now.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the title of my talk here has actually changed from what's on the schedule, and that was just based on some edits we made to the manuscript as it's gone through a series of reviews. But the new title is Soil Characteristics Associated with the Variable Recovery of Big Sagebrush Canopy Structure After Disturbance, and specifically after fire. Some of the motivations for this project, Matt Germino talked about this quite a bit yesterday, that sagebrush recovery after fire tends to be pretty patchy on the landscape. There's not only a lot of spatial heterogeneity in where it does and does not recover after fire, but there's also a large amount of variability in how the canopy structure can actually recover after fire as well. And that variability in canopy structure recovery is important because various forms of wildlife depend on sagebrush for forage and shelter throughout the year. And so there's different needs for canopy height versus cover percentage, and even the density of plants within an area. All these have different and important effects on how wildlife will interact with sagebrush. And also that there's different processes that drive the germination and establishment of seeds that are applied after fire versus the processes that may actually constrain growth. We can have completely different landscape, biophysical, climatological drivers of these two completely different processes. And it's one of the reasons that we wanted to look specifically in areas where sagebrush has successfully, and I'm going to put air quotes around successfully, but successfully reestablish after fire and seeding treatments. And we wanted to understand, explain, and predict some of the canopy redevelopment patterns, and to try to prioritize some readily identifiable soil characteristics in the field that land managers and others can use to possibly identify how prone a specific site may be to sagebrush recovery, and also the rates of the recovery of the canopy. And we also wanted to include some simple climate and fire history predictors as well. The motivation here being, we want to have a forecasting perspective with the study. So we're going to look specifically at mean annual climate and some soil characteristics that are going to be perennial to that site. They're not going to change. it would be a little bit better if we could look specifically at precipitation that followed the year of fire and seeding, but we do want to make this more about the site itself instead of about the interannual variability in climate that may accompany some of these disturbances. So looking at some of these readily identifiable soil surface characteristics that can be recorded in the field, the two that we specifically chose to focus on were the pedoderm and the biological soil crust cover. And the pedoderm, for those who are not familiar with it, is a classification developed by the NRCS and the Jornada Experimental Station. And it classifies the surface of the soil into one of 13 different categories based on some of the erosion patterns, also biological crust or any other bacterial cover. And you can see that these fall into these 13 different groups. For the study that I'm going to discuss moving forward, we only looked at a few of them, and those are the ones that are in the darker font. We did not record the rest of those in our sample sites. In terms of biological soil crust, we used a slightly modified version of the Rosentreter et al. Field Guide to Biological Soil Crust in the Western United States. And so we characterize the biological crust at each site into one of 5 categories, the first being with no biological soil crust present. And then the second, third, and fourth all relate to the developmental stage of the soil biological crust, with cover ranging from 10 to greater than 40%. And then also with the surface roughness that actually develops from these biocrust morphology ranging in 1 to 3 centimeter to 1 to 5 centimeter roughness ranges. And then the fifth category was just a smooth cyanobacteria crust where lichen and moss were primarily absent, and there was little change in roughness to the surface, no more than 1 centimeter. And I just wanted to kind of go back a bit and talk about a recent study by Germino et al., which actually focused on sagebrush recovery in relation to the pedoderm, and this is across the Soda Fire burn area in southern Idaho. And in this figure on the left, you see the black bars indicate the proportion of all plots that were characterized by each of these different pedoderm types. And then the lighter gray bars indicate the proportion of those plots within that pedoderm that were occupied by sagebrush. And this is in the year immediately following fire and aerial seeding. The graph on the right relates a coefficient from a resource selection function. And basically the take home here is that if you use a weak physical or biological crust, which is the most predominant pedoderm across the landscape that we sampled, if you use that as a reference level, we see that bare grain soils and soil aggregates had a higher probability of sagebrush occupancy versus the rest of the pedoderms, which had a lower probability of occupancy compared to that reference level of weak physical biological crust. But please note that strong physical crust, duff, strong biological crust, and cemented horizon did not have a significant difference, but the means were overall a lower probability than the reference level. So returning back to the study at hand, the map on the left shows all of the sample plots within the SageSuccess domain where we had sagebrush present. There were 250 plots total included that had sagebrush in them. However, 55 of those we were unable to assess with substantial certainty that the sagebrush were not remnants that had remained from before the fire. So that gave us a final sample size of 195 plots that we'll use for the analyses that I'm going to discuss for the rest of this talk. On the right here, you see some distributions of the landscape characteristics and some fire history information for those 195 plots. Starting at the top, we see that the heat load, which is basically a summary metric of the slope, angle, aspect, and latitude of the plot. It's basically a metric of incident solar radiation. We see that that's relatively normally distributed. The middle graph shows mean annual precipitation, which is the climate variable we chose to focus on because these records are relatively easy to obtain. And we see there's kind of a bimodal distribution there where we have a lot of plots at lower mean annual precipitations and then another local maxima of plots at higher levels of precipitation. The bottom one shows soil depth, which we measured by pounding a rebar into the ground. And you see that second peak at 100 centimeters, basically because we were using 100 centimeter rebar. And if we got the rebar all the way into the ground, we just recorded the depth as 100 centimeters. Further to the right, we see that the majority of plots had just 1 or 2 fires, with the number of fires decreasing across plots. And then we also see a relatively normal distribution of the years since the last fire in the plots that we sampled. Now, in terms of the actual metrics of sagebrush canopy recovery that we looked at, these are some more probability density functions of sagebrush cover percentage, height in the middle, and density, which is measured as sagebrush per meter squared. And we see that both for cover and density that the distributions are skewed towards lower numbers. However, height is relatively normally distributed. So that's interesting that we see a lot of areas that have lower cover, but we see basically relatively standardized recovery in terms of height, but much more distribution in terms of recovery of cover and density. And across the plots that we sampled, we also wanted to look at the distribution of our different Biocrust classification, pediderm types, and also soil textures that were measured from field collected samples. And interestingly, we see that the vast majority of plots, looking at the very top panel here, that the vast majority of plots had no Biocrust present. And then also kind of counterintuitively, we had this decreasing abundance going from late to early Biocrust classification. So there's actually more late Biocrust than there are early, probably depending on when the fire occurred and when it was sampled. We also see that bare grain soil and weak physical or biological crust are the most dominant pediderm types, with rock mulch and soil aggregates also being common on the landscape. And then we also see that overall the soil textures that we measured were primarily coarse grain soils, specifically loam, silt loam, and sandy loam, with the other 4 soil types being less frequent on the landscape. So we took all of these data and put them into a mixed effects model to tease out some of these effects and to try to develop some predictive coefficients moving forward. And interestingly, when we compare all the different pediderms to the bare grain soil reference level, we see some interesting effects. For example, the presence of soil aggregates has a negative effect on density and canopy cover compared to the reference level of bare grain soil, whereas it has an opposite effect on height. So we have a certain soil characteristic that promotes higher sagebrush density and canopy cover, but at the same time, the opposite of that, where it inhibits sagebrush density and canopy cover, but it actually promotes sagebrush height. And then we also see, moving down the list right there in the center, that poorly developed biocrust has a positive effect on canopy cover, but it seems to not have an effect on density or height, whereas strongly developed biocrust has no significant different effect from the reference level of bare grain soil. Now focusing more specifically on biocrust morphology, interestingly, we saw no real effects of any biocrust morphology in terms of associations with sagebrush recovery when compared to a reference level of none. So we did see a significant effect of those mid-development stage biocrusts compared to none in terms of canopy cover, but for the rest of these, we found no significant effects, which basically indicates that there is no true association between that biocrust morphology and the rate of sagebrush recovery. There's a lot more work needed in this area, but just in terms of statistical associations, we found few significant relationships. Now looking specifically at soil texture, we start to see a few more interesting relationships. Specifically, starting on the left, we see that some of the coarser soil types have a positive effect on density compared to the finer clay, and we see similar effects for canopy cover in the middle columns, where we see coarser textures have a positive effect versus reference level clay. But then we see the opposite effect when we start looking at height. So in reference to clay, all of the coarser soil types actually had a negative effect on height at each plot, indicating that sagebrush height can be quite commonly influenced positively by more clay soil types. The one confounding factor here is that we do have a difficulty differentiating between basin big sage and Wyoming sage, for example. So there is the potential that some of these taller plants that we measured in more clay areas that get more runoff and sediment deposition could actually just be a different subspecies. Now looking finally at some of the site-specific perennial characteristics, we saw a negative effect of heat load on both density and canopy cover, but then another counterintuitive increase in height. Soil depth was positively associated with all components of canopy recovery. But then interestingly, we didn't find a lot of consistent relationships between the number of fires, the years since the last fire, or the mean precipitation of that area. We did see positive effects for a number of fires and mean precipitation on height, but not for canopy cover or density. And there's also a lot going on here. I know Bob Shriver's recent paper in Global Change Biology pointed not so much to the mean annual precipitation, but the snow water equivalent that's available to sagebrush in the spring having a larger impact. But still, in terms of a easily accessible climate metric, mean annual precipitation is commonly used. So we're pretty interested to see that a lot of soil effects actually surpassed some of these climate drivers in terms of how sagebrush was able to recover after fire and seeding treatment. So just to wrap up with a couple of quick conclusions, thought it was interesting that biocrusts were largely absent from sample sites. We have a pretty good range of time since last fire, but we still found the majority of plots to be absent of biocrust. We also found large gradients to exist in the canopy redevelopment of sagebrush after fire. And interestingly, the coarser texture of soils seem to be associated with greater cover and density, whereas some of the finer textured soils were more closely associated with height development. And then interestingly, some of the broader biocrust classifications in the pediderm seem to be sufficient for helping us to explain some of these recovery metrics, and that taking it to the next level and using these finer scale characterizations of biocrust community and development ranges doesn't really help to add explanatory power. At least it did not in this study. This is still a very interesting interaction between sagebrush recovery and biocrust development. So I think this is an area that needs much more research in the future. And then just to reiterate, soils in this study appeared to be a little bit more important of a driver of gradients in sagebrush canopy recovery versus some of these more standardized landscape and climate characteristics such as mean annual precipitation or heat load. So with that, I'll go ahead and close this out, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you. So first, a general SageSuccess Project wide question, and then more specific questions to your presentation. The first question, are there any plans to undertake some of these same types of studies in the shortgrass prairie-esque vegetation zones?
That is a good question, and I do not know of any specific ones. I know that there's an ARS group in Fort Collins that works quite a bit in the shortgrass steppe, but I am not certain.
Okay, thanks. If anyone else knows, you can chime in. All right, and then you might have touched on this in your conclusion slide, but two kind of back-to-back questions. How much faith do you have in your early, mid, late biocrust categories? I guess that's the first question.
Okay. Pretty good faith. We used relatively simple metrics to classify into each of those 5 different groups. So I think that at the plot level, the sites were characterized relatively well. The thing that I have less confidence in is if those are the categories that would actually be predictive of sagebrush responses. We took a pretty simple look at it. So there could be other components in terms of the actual the community of the biocrust, some of the health, and other metrics of those Biocrust communities that may be more predictive of sagebrush.
Okay, great. And then are you sure that biocrusts were absent from most of the sites, or could some have possibly been missed?
It's entirely possible that they could have been missed. I mean, these samples, David Pilliard covered it yesterday. We're looking at spoke plots, aim style sampling, and there are a lot of things that are being sampled, and the field crews have quite a few things to keep running through their heads as they're monitoring the site. So it's entirely possible that yes, some of these sites were missed, but I would imagine that if the biocrust was present at a site where we recorded it as absent, it was probably in a very small proportion of the total cover, and may have a little bit less of an explanatory effect on landscape processes at that level, but it may still have been there in the first place.
Okay, thank you. Next question, could you reiterate the influence of depth to water limiting layer on height regardless of species?
Yes, so I think I understand this question too. I brought up the potential for a subspecies, specifically basin big sage, potentially having greater canopy height in more clayey soils. And my understanding of it is that the basin big sage tends to grow in deeper soil areas, which also tend to be in areas that receive a lot of sediment transport. And I believe that the overall texture of soils in these areas tends to be a little bit finer. So while we did see a significant relationship between overall height and that clay soil, we were not able to distinguish amongst species. Similar to Matt Germino's talk yesterday, it's very difficult to identify 2 species in the field. So there's a chance that we do have some basin big sage that are measured in these more clayey areas that are simply taller just based on subspecies properties as opposed to soil-driven effects.
Okay, thank you. Next question, were all these sites in seeded sites or were they all natural recovery?
No, these were all seeded sites, all aerially seeded or distributed with tractors.
All right, great. Based upon your results, can you recommend any desktop GIS tools to help managers prioritize seeding sites?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have any that come to mind. The Surgo data set may be of some use for this. I mean, this study focused specifically on field sampled soil texture, but Surgo data sets, StatsGo, and even some of the soil grids, even though it's at a much coarser resolution, can use this. But I also wanted to point out the LTDL and the land treatment planning tool, which is being developed by Justin Welty here Justin Welty and David Pilliard here at the Snake River Field Station, which will have some of these layers available for use.
Okay, great. Did you account for grazing in the absence of biocrusts on your site?
I did not. That's a very good question, but no, I did not.
Okay, and the last question, did you consider the source of the seeds in contributing to the variation in establishment?
We have some information on seed source. The problem is some of these treatments are from long enough ago that the seed source information wasn't recorded, or we have low confidence in the seed source information that was included. So that's a project that we're working on, and handling the uncertainty of where the seeds are actually coming from may lead to as much uncertainty as some of the landscape factors. So we're currently working on that.
Okay, great. All right, thanks everyone for the great questions. All right, so now we'll move on to Bob Shriver. I will make you the presenter. Thanks, Dave. All right. All right, Bob Shriver is a postdoctoral research ecologist with the USGS Southwest Biological Science Center. He did his undergraduate degree in biology at the University of Wyoming and his PhD in ecology at Duke University. His research integrates mathematical and statistical models with data to understand how plants, including sagebrush, are responding to changing climate and disturbance. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks, Janie. So today I'm going to talk about some work I've been doing as a postdoc at the USGS, and so I'll just go ahead and get started. So as a lot of the talks have alluded to thus far, seeding is a widely used practice across the Great Basin to try to speed up recovery or enhance resilience. And so the hope is that by seeding a landscape after fire occurs, you're going to prevent the establishment of less desirable non-native species like cheatgrass and promote the establishment of sagebrush and other native plants. There we go. But as Dave Pilley had talked about yesterday and sort of pointed out, this group has done previous research that basically shows that there's little overall benefit of actually seeding when you go out and monitor plots 15 years after disturbance and seeding occurs. What you see is there's very little difference in areas that were seeded versus those that were nearby and left unseeded. And that difference is particularly dramatic when you compare it to areas that were left unburned, where cover is many, many times higher. And so this has sort of led to a search to try to understand what the mechanisms are that inhibit recovery and how we can sort of improve restoration outcomes. And so that research is pointed towards a lot of different mechanisms, including climate and weather at the time of seeding that could influence germination and establishment of plants, invasive species. So if cheatgrass becomes established, initially it might be difficult for sagebrush recruitment following that to occur. Soil characteristics or erosion can also be really important, as Dave Barnard just talked about. But we actually have a really poor understanding of how we should expect sagebrush to recover even in the absence of these changes. So if climate doesn't change or if there isn't an increase in invasive species, we know very little about how we should expect sagebrush recovery to occur or what that should look like. And I think there's sort of a general underlying assumption in most of restoration ecology that basically the population or cover of sagebrush or another species was sort of has this long-term average, and then disturbance wipes out that population. But then once propagule limitation or seed limitation is eliminated, a population should sort of naturally begin to recover and increase in both cover and density. But there's actually a lot of reasons based off theoretical population biology why we shouldn't expect that to actually occur. And so one part of that is basically disturbance dramatically alters the structures of populations. And so you might have had a population that was relatively mature and had lots of adult large individuals to begin with, but that population is wiped out and the entire population is essentially replaced by small seeds and seedlings. And that can be really important because for most plants, survival and reproduction increase as a function of size. So small individuals tend to produce less seed and they have lower survival, whereas larger individuals produce more seed and have higher survival. And so where you might have had a population with larger individuals before disturbance, the population had higher reproductive rates, higher survival rates, and the population is growing or is stable. Disturbance wipes that out, and the population is basically replaced by smaller individuals that have lower overall reproduction, lower survival, and so a population that may have been stable before disturbance is now declining after disturbance. And so just to visualize that in a different way, you can think of how a population size structure might change over time following disturbance. So initially after seeding, you have a larger number of smaller individuals. And then as those individuals grow, they also die. And so individuals get larger, but the population also declines in size. And then eventually you're gonna reach a sort of long-term stable size distribution for that population. But during the interim, you might expect that the populations actually decline initially and then kind of bottom out, and then it could take a long time for recovery to begin afterwards. And so population ecologists refer to this phenomenon as transient population dynamics, which is basically the idea that just because of changes in the population size structure from this mature developed population to a population dominated by smaller individuals, that you get different population dynamics. And this can have really important implications for restoration ecology. First, as a population declines and the population density gets really low, there's an increased risk of local extinction. So if you only have a few individuals across your landscape, the likelihood that those individuals are going to die because of random events increases. And once they're eliminated, you basically have to start over and reseed. But even in the absence of sort of local extinction, it also means that recovery is likely to be really prolonged. So for example, in this graph, we basically, the population bottoms out at about 5 or 6 years, but it still takes nearly 40 years for it to recover to its pre-disturbance density. And so we were interested in investigating what the role of these changes in population size structure after disturbance and the resulting transient dynamics was in driving sagebrush restoration outcomes across the Great Basin. And so we collected data on population size structures, so just the heights of individuals at 531 populations across the Great Basin. And at the same time, we collected data on the initial seeding rates that all of those sites were seeded at following fire from the Land Treatment Digital Library. And the sites sort of span the entire Great Basin, but also a sort of range of time since seeding. So the most recent ones were 2 years after the seeding occurred, and the longest ones were all the way out at 36 years after the initial seeding occurred. But this is still relatively sparse data. We only have the initial seeding rate and then what the size distribution looked like some amount of time later. And so models are actually a really powerful tool to be able to understand what drives the populations in the interim. And the reason I'm putting this slide up here is just to emphasize the fact that models are a really important tool to basically understand what goes on in these restored populations in the absence of really detailed monitoring data. And so we can use the changes in size distributions that we observe over time to infer what the survival and growth and reproduction rates are within these populations, and then use that to reconstruct what the population dynamics look like after restoration occurs in sagebrush. And so just to look at some of that data from Sagebrush, I have here plotted the sort of inferred population dynamics in each one of these populations from the time of seeding until some amount of time later. And what we find is if you look at the population's size structures, generally populations shortly after seeding, the year after seeding, are dominated by smaller individuals that are under a half a meter tall. And as the population develops, individuals die off, so these bars decrease, but they also sort of grow in size. And so we get a larger number of large individuals. And eventually by the time you get to year 20, there's a sort of base of larger individuals that are kind of anchoring the population. And when you look at that in terms of overall population density, so here, each blue line is a individual population, and the black line is the average across all of the populations. And so some populations see a big flush of initial establishments and some see much less. But overall, the average is that populations decline pretty dramatically initially. And it's really only about year 15 that the populations begin to grow. And so it takes about 15 years of population decline for the population to actually sort of grow and develop and get these larger individuals before they really begin to grow. So decline that should be expected about 15 years after restoration seeding occurs, and then the recovery really starts to take hold after that. And so this red line here indicates what the average density of sagebrush is in undisturbed plots. And so that gives you an idea of the sort of timeline for recovery. And we can think about that also in terms of total cover of sagebrush in a plot. And so when we look at total cover, what we see is that cover is basically consistently below 5% on average across all of these plots for about 15 to 20 years, and then recovery really starts to occur. And this is basically because initially you might have a large number of individuals, but they're all small, and so the cover isn't very high. And then those individuals grow, but they're also dying, and so cover isn't really increasing much. And it's really by the time you get out to year 15 that the cover, you should expect cover to really start to increase. And so I just wanted to return to this graph because it provides a sort of useful heuristic to try to quantify the importance of these transient dynamics and changes in population size structure in driving restoration outcomes. And so what we can do is we can basically look at what the population dynamics were right after restoration occurred or right after seeding occurred, and what the long-term dynamics of the populations would be. And so this is basically providing a metric of whether or not a population is even viable in a location. And this basically tells you how likely you are to be able to recover after disturbance. And so we can compare these near-term population growth rates observed after seeding to the long-term population growth rates to basically quantify the importance of transient population dynamics. And so what we see is if you look at the long-term population growth rate, so this, you can think of this as what might happen in the long term if the population becomes established, or what was happening potentially before disturbance. What we see is that most of these populations actually have a potential to grow or be stable. So all of the red and green points here are basically populations where their 95% confidence interval overlaps with 1. And so anything at or above 1 is a stable or growing population. But then once you take into account that these populations after disturbance are starting from seed, we see that almost across the board, the population growth rates are dramatically reduced. And so what we see is that for many of these populations, all of these red points, it basically goes from a population that has the potential to be stable to declining. And so these are ones that basically all shift below that 1 line. And so in some cases, populations are declining at 50 to 80% a year. And so when you're losing half to 80% of your individuals in a given year, there's only so many years a population is going to continue to be viable. So this is basically the difference between what's happening in a mature sagebrush population versus what happens right after restoration. So it's really a really different population that we're dealing with right after restoration occurs. And I think these results have some really important implications for management. First, it sort of helps us establish a timeline for what restoration should look like. And so really population development recovery for sagebrush is a decades-long process, and we shouldn't necessarily expect to see much positive or negative results after a year. And monitoring that occurs just within a few years after that might not be the best indicator of long-term outcomes. And also for many sites, recovery from seed might not be possible, or it's going to be really difficult. So as I showed you in those red points, those are all sites that have the potential to support established sagebrush populations. But once disturbance occurs on a wide scale, they may not actually be able to recover from seed without really intensive management intervention. And along those same lines, it sort of highlights alternative restoration strategies, including planting larger individuals, which Dave Pyke is going to talk about shortly after me, or the potential to do multiple seedings. So multiple seedings is basically sort of hedging your bets against local extinction by trying to seed over multiple years and reduce the likelihood of local extinction. And that is all I have, but I just wanted to highlight that because of our limited time, I only had time to talk about one aspect of the research that we're working on, but these are a couple other papers that recently came out that might be of interest. And if you are unable to access them, feel free to give me an email. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, if you have any immediate questions for Bob, you can type them in. There aren't any right now in the queue, so I will go ahead and switch over to Dave's presentation.
Okay, thank you, Jeannie.
All right, well, let me introduce you, Dave.
Oh, there you go.
All right, Dave Pyke is a plant ecologist with the USGS Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center in Corvallis, Oregon. His research focuses on the population ecology of native and invasive plants in the Intermountain West, with an emphasis on restoring native plants on invaded landscapes. He also specializes in developing monitoring protocols for ecosystem integrity on wild lands. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks, Jeannie. Okay, so as Bob mentioned, what we're going to do now is we're going to take the information that we've been talking about now for these 2 days and look at some options that we might have available to us for being able to do restoration in alternative fashions and compare that back to the seeding aspects that we've been talking about most of the time here. What I'm going to try and do is combine two projects that we're involved in, both the SageSuccess Project, which most of these talks have been involved with, and then also a new project that we began a couple of years ago, which is called the Field of Sagebrush Dreams, where we're trying to use some transplants to apply some of the information associated with what we're learning with these studies with SageSuccess. We're going to, in this talk, consider two options on seeding and planting with containerized plants. And then we're going to discuss some of the advantages and disadvantages of those kinds of techniques. And then I'll spend some time looking at some of the size advantages that you might have with big sagebrush that could be conferred with using transplants. And the question remains, do those kinds of size advantages exist? And if they do, for how long? And then how does that transpire into an application framework for actually planting these plants in different fashions to try and achieve different goals? So, looking at comparisons then between seeding and planting using transplants, certainly seeding is going to be to your advantage if you've got a large area that you're going to be trying to establish the plants. But the establishment locations on those areas may be less predictable. And we found that with much of the projects that we've been involved with the SageSuccess, as well as some of the other studies where we've looked at sagebrush seedings. But with plantings, if you're certainly going to be limited to smaller areas to be able to work in, but those establishment locations are going to be much more predictable. And our survivorship associated with those areas tends to be much higher at that early phase of the development of the population. So it's not so much dependent upon moisture as it is with seeding. You can get away with actually planting into some areas that might be drier for a particular year and still maintain a better survival on those locations. If we're seeding in an area, we've found that we can have better success if we're seeding on higher elevation locations that have higher amounts of precipitation with lower temperature. With the transplants, we can get away with being able to plant into an area that may not have had as high amount of precipitation that it would have normally. And we can typically get roughly around 30% survival in the first several years of the transplants that are being placed out in the landscape. But what about the question associated with the sizes over time? This is going to influence our development of cover, as Bob has already mentioned, and the height development of these plants. And this can be important for dealing with sage-grouse habitat and so forth. When we seed, the competing plants are also competing with whatever other plants are out in that landscape, which many times ends up being many of our invasive annual grasses as well. When we do the transplants, in some cases, they're also going to have to compete, but they may have an advantage of, depending upon how we're doing the transplanting, of actually getting those roots down below the rooting zone of the annual grasses. So that may be an advantage with the transplants. Now, in terms of size advantage for transplants, there have been a couple of studies that have been done where they've compared transplants to seeded ones. And let's first look at a blue oak study that was done down in California, where they had seeded individuals that they compared to containerized plants that they planted at the same time, and then compared them for 4 different years after the 4 different seasons after they had been planted. And what you can see from this is that the blue bars are indicating the seeded plants, and the height of the seeded plants are actually greater than the heights of the containerized plants for the blue oak. This is not atypical. This actually can happen. And it was thought that in this particular study that much of the result of the stunting of the growth of the containerized plants was due to the fact that the roots of the blue oak were actually beginning to get twisted in the containers prior to the transplanting. So actually making sure that you've got good containerized stock and getting them out there quickly is an important factor. Looking at sagebrush, however, there haven't been many studies that have actually done this. Bruce Welch did a study where he looked at seeded individuals of sagebrush, both mountain sagebrush and Wyoming sagebrush, and compared those to containerized plants and planted into a common garden. And in this particular study, he compared the biomass of the plants. So he harvested them after 3 growing seasons. And you can see that the seeded plants actually did much, much better in terms of their growth than the containerized plants in this particular case. So this, again, is an indication that seeded plants may do better, but then the question is, how often are we successful with our seeded individuals? So this is something that we have to keep in mind as we're putting these plants out in the landscape. So with the SageSuccess Project, you've seen the spread of points for the various sites. In this particular study that I'm going to talk about, we actually looked at 28 different sites, and we looked at sites that had a range in age that went from about 2 years after planting or seeding all the way up to about 14, 15 years after planting and seeding. We also tried to get sites that were in both low resistance resilience to high resistance resilience kinds of locations as well. And so these sites were split between locations where seedings were done and then locations where transplants were done, and not necessarily in the same location. So we had about 1,200 plants that were seeded, 1,300 plants that were transplanted. We actually did individual measurements on those plants. We recorded plant height in centimeters, and then we took 2 diameter measurements of the canopy for those plants, and then derived a canopy area using a formula of an ellipse. So let's look at height to begin with. The height of these plants, I'm going to have a couple of different graphs here. In this case, the measurement that we will be looking at will be on the y-axis. The years since planting will be on the x-axis. And the seeded plants will be the dark, either dots or the line. And then the plants, the containerized plants that had been planted in the area are going to be the other ones. And so for height, let's put a line across this graph at about 30 centimeters, because this is the minimum sagebrush height that we oftentimes look at for sage-grouse nests. And what we find is that transplants tend to achieve this height in about the first, right around the 3 to 4 years, whereas the seeded plants require an additional year in order to be able to get to that point. But what we do find is that the seeded plants tend to catch up with the transplanted individuals, and they tend to catch up in height somewhere around the 5th or 6th year after planting. But once again, keep in mind that you have to have the successful seeding in order to be able to get those plants. How about canopy diameter and canopy area? In this particular case, same sort of setup for this slide. And what you'll see is that for canopy area, canopy diameter, that it does not differ after about that first growing season. So the plants that are successful that have been seeded will in fact develop canopy areas roughly at about the same rate that the canopies of the transplanted plants will. So what it boils down to, and this is getting back to what Bob was talking about, is the density of the plants in the area really develop the population, and the population then is going to regulate the coverage that you'll actually see on that location. So it's important to be able to have enough plants to be able to gain the cover that you'd like to have, especially for things like sage-grouse nests. So let's take this information and see if we can begin to apply it. What we've done now is to set up a couple of different locations where we're actually applying some of this information. We're taking this into this from SageSuccess and now applying this into locations where we have known locations that sage grouse have nested. We're actually replanting using transplants in these locations. And what you see here is a diagram that shows you a background set of plants at 1 meter spacings. And then within that, we have clusters of plants that where we've additionally added another 21 plants around those original plants to give us a area that has a fairly dense planting. And then we expect to only have about 30% of those survive. And we believe that within about 4 years, we will have plants that will actually achieve what we think would be a potential nesting habitat for sage grouse. And we have some initial results that have come out of this for heights. We have it split up into 3 different sites. So we have resistance and resilience. So this would be your better site, a moderate resistance and resilience location, all the way down to a fairly dry, hot and dry site with very thin soils. And you can see that the heights don't change too much, that the plants that are in that were not clustered tended to be a little bit taller than the plants that were clustered in the areas. And then we have canopy area, and which we didn't expect. The canopy area of those that were of the least resistant, resilient landscapes actually had greater canopy area than those that were in a little bit better landscapes. And we think this could be, in fact, related to some of the types of environments that we're planting into. These were highly combination of both cheatgrass and medusa head. Whether that influences the canopy area, we're not certain or not. So to conclude this talk, the question we ask is, should you seed? Well, if it's going to be a large area, clearly that's to your advantage economically. But as Bob pointed out, you're going to have to do that either on multiple years if you're not successful the first time, or to consider using transplants and at least widely spaced transplants across a large area. If you're transplanting, there are a number of different options on how to be able to do that. And one we believe that you might want to consider would be this whole idea of trying to cluster a series of transplants around one another to be able to create canopies that would intermingle with one another with the surviving individual plants, thereby producing a denser canopy that might be more applicable for use by sage grouse, especially in nesting habitat. But regardless of what you use, you need to be able to use the best management practices for those treatments. That means selecting the appropriate seed for that area, and also making sure that if you are going to use transplants, that the transplants have been treated and prepared appropriately for getting out into the landscape. So at that point, I'll answer any questions, or we can open it up to the group.
Okay, thanks, Dave. First question, what type of seeding was done? Mechanical, aerial, etc.?
This is the same as the other project that Dave Barnard talked about. So all of the seeding that was done either aerially or broadcast using tractors. It would have had, if there was any kind of broadcasting or aerial applications, some of them may have used some secondary approaches to be able to get the seed in better contact with the soil. Others may not have. So it just depended upon the location.
Okay, thanks. Could you compare cost, availability, and seasonal constraints on Artemisia tridentata transplants?
Costs will vary, depends on the contractor you get them from. The cost will go up. Oftentimes if you're going to be collecting your own seed, relative to whether you're going to contract out to have somebody else collect the seed. If you're purchasing plants that have just been collected by some grower someplace, then you need to be dealing with site-identified seeds so that you know what you're getting in terms of the transplants that you're going to be putting out into the field. So all of those things come into play. I've also tried to talk to people about not just cost per plant, but also cost per surviving plant in making comparisons that way. I believe, and don't quote me on this, but I think we were getting plants from that were grown through the Sagebrush prison program, and those were actually more expensive than some of the other plants. I think we were paying more like $1.30 to $1.50 per plant, I believe.
Okay, thanks. Why are seeded species not showing up on the height or canopy graphs after year 10?
Probably because we didn't have any that fell into that the series of categories that we were looking for resistance and resilience and age combinations. I'd have to go back and see.
Okay, thanks. Well, maybe the asker, you are welcome to email Dave later.
Yeah, I don't think we had any beyond that year 10.
Oh, okay. All right, thanks. Have you tried or considered replacing the clusters with more mature plants 2 to 3 years to achieve nesting habitat sooner?
No, we haven't tried that. 2 to 3 year old plants, you run the risk of beginning to, the pots would have to be so deep in order to be able to get plants that way. Your alternative would be to actually take a spade tool out into, natural fields and collect a plant with the soil to actually dig that up. And you run the risk of digging up the taproot of the sagebrush in doing that. And so I'd be concerned about doing it and whether it would be successful. It'd be an interesting objective to try, but we haven't done that at all. And I'm not aware of anybody else.
Okay, thank you. What is the appropriate treatment you mentioned for transplants before planting them?
Well, okay. Once they've been grown in a greenhouse, they should be hardened outside. So getting used to the appropriate temperatures that you will have at the time period that you're going to be planting them. All of our transplants, well, I shouldn't say the ones on SageSuccess because oftentimes we didn't know. The ones that we're doing on Field of Dreams, we're planting those in the fall. And so they come out of the greenhouse, go into like a lath house to start to cool down in the fall. And then once they're transported out to the sites, they're kept into shady locations. We try and make sure that they maintain moisture. We haven't done too much in terms of restricting. We had some that were out even under freezing temperatures, and we tried to insulate them as much as possible so that the roots didn't freeze too much. But sagebrush are pretty hardy that way, and they seem to be able to withstand pretty cold temperatures. So I wasn't too concerned about that aspect of it.
Great, thank you. For restoring populations in targeted high priority areas, is there evidence that transplanting is more effective than seeding at high densities? In other words, can you increase the probability of successful establishment with higher density seedings?
Higher density seedings. People have used higher seed rates in some locations for seeding. I don't know that they have been any more successful with higher seeding rates than the lower seeding rates. I don't think that it's the seeding rate itself that is causing the loss of or the lack of establishment. It's more likely related to the weather conditions of that year right after the seeding. So that first spring growing season, then moving into the summer and going through that summer dry period are probably the two most important time periods for the survival of the seedlings.
Okay, thank you. Due to the importance of black sagebrush as greater sage-grouse winter habitat forage and the increasing rate of fires in black sagebrush, is there similar research for restoring this species?
I know of a couple of people who are doing some work right now, but it's mostly, I think it's one PhD student that I'm aware of that's doing some work. I haven't really seen too much other than that with black sage.
Sounds like an opportunity.
It clearly is.
All right, were herbicide treatments used in these seedings or plantings?
Probably, but we didn't actually evaluate that aspect of it.
Okay.
Not all of them would have been herbicided, and given the length of time that we've had and the injunction that BLM was under for a long period of time using herbicides, it probably was only related. Many of them might have only been related to using something like Roundup in the springtime, which may not have been ultimately very effective for doing sagebrush seedings on areas. So I don't know that we've got much, in good information on that.
Okay, thank you. Do you make the holes with a dibble or an auger, and do you have problems with frost heaving?
That's a good question. If we had the luxury of working in areas that didn't have rocks, we would use a dibble if we could. But we have the sites that we have been doing this in, both in Susanville and outside of Reno, are extremely stony areas. And so we've used a soil auger, about a 4-inch diameter auger bit, and try and get it as deep as we possibly can. However, I know that I talked with some of the BLM offices, and I believe that the office at Twin Falls, maybe Burley, were going out and they were planting. I believe that was done with a dibble stick on some fairly loamy soils or even sandy soils, and they were getting a lot more plants into the ground than we were able to on our site. So if you have the luxury of soils that aren't stony and are going to be coarse enough that you can get a dibble stick into, it will allow for a lot more plants to be able to go into the ground over a shorter period of time.
Okay, I have a comment that yes, southern Idaho often uses dibble planters.
Yep.
Okay, let's see. Matt also wanted me to remind people, this was back from a prior comment, and about the land treatment. I forget what it used to be called, and now it's being called the Land Treatment Exploration Tool. So we just wanted to make that clarification. What was the prior name again? Do you remember?
Digital Library.
Land
Digital Library.
Yeah, Land Treatment Digital Library is now being called the Land Treatment Exploration Tool. So just wanted to let everyone know that.
Actually, Jenny, they're two separate things. The LTDL still is there and housing all of the treatment information about these land treatments, and the exploration tool has a different goal of taking that information and helping future planning efforts and things like that.
That's right.
So
thank you.
They're related.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. All right, well, that looks like the last question. All of this is so interesting. I feel like I have questions for another hour, but we have to stop. Oh, I forgot, before we part, regarding that last question, what about the frost heaving part? The questioner was wondering about that.
Oh, okay. We haven't run into the frost heaving at this point. We've seen some frost heaving. I shouldn't say that we haven't seen it. We have seen frost heaving occur. The first set of plants that were put in 2 to 3 years ago had some frost heaving, especially in the areas that had more clay associated with them. We had some soils that had some soil cracking, and if the soil cracked in that area, and then you had the frost heaving of the plant in the area where it cracked. So it is a possibility of something that could occur, but I would say the vast majority of the plants that we've put in the ground have stayed the way we've actually planted them.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, well, great discussion, everyone, and thanks all for your participation. Our next webinar series will be on decision support tools, but we're still working on those dates, so stay tuned. Let's see. Oh yeah, there was a comment, make sure the location of these webinar recordings is sent out to all of us. That will be, I'm getting to that right just next. So I'll post the recording of this webinar on our Great Basin Fire Science YouTube channel this afternoon or tomorrow morning, and then the link will be automatically sent to you through the GoToWebinar system tomorrow. But you can always email me and if something goes awry with that, and I'll send it to you. And we'd greatly appreciate it if you would take our 3-question survey that appears after a webinar closes. If you have further questions regarding this or other webinars, please email or call me anytime. Let's see, and then there's just comments about thank you and great job, everyone. And yes, thank you so much, Dave B, Bob, and Dave P for your presentations. All right, have a great day, everybody.